Welcome back, everyone. Oz here, and today I've got some r/stories about Kevin for you all. As per usual, I'll be reading you the posts, giving you my opinions, and I hope you do the same down in the comments below. And without further ado, let's jump right into it. Today we've got a single saga from Stories About Kevin, posted by Go Full Eggplant. Kevin reports to the DFAC, Part 1. I have been in the United States Army for 9 years. I have deployed twice. I have been an NCO for 5 of those years, 3 of them as a sergeant. I have supervised soldiers who were lazy. I have supervised soldiers who were drunk. I have supervised soldiers who were both of those things at the same time and still managed to show up to formation with their boots on their right feet. Then, the Army gave me Kevin. I need to get this down somewhere because I've been telling these stories at cookouts and in parking lots after work for 2 years, and I'm tired of watching people's faces go through the same 5 stages. So here it is, all of it. Everything I'm about to describe happened at Fort Bragg. Yes, I know. They renamed it, I don't care, it's Bragg. Kevin was a 92G. For civilians, that's a cook. The Army calls it a culinary specialist now because someone at HRC decided that sounded more dignified on a resume, but the job is the same. You work in a DFAC, a dining facility. You prepare food, you serve food, you clean up after food, you follow TB-MED 530, which is the Army's regulation on food safety and sanitation. And you do not deviate from it because the regulations exist for a reason. And that reason is that people have gotten very sick and sometimes died when cooks decided they knew better. I ran a shift in the DFAC at the time, breakfast and lunch, which means my alarm went off at 3:30 every morning, which means I have not slept past 5 o'clock voluntarily since 2019, and probably never will again. My team was solid. I had 4 cooks who knew their jobs, showed up on time, and understood that the building we worked in fed soldiers who had real missions and deserved food that wouldn't put them in the hospital. We were not a 5-star restaurant. We were not trying to be. We were trying to hit safe temperatures, rotate stock, and get through the serving line without an incident. That was the standard. It was not a high bar. Or so I thought. Kevin arrived on a Tuesday in September. I know it was Tuesday because I had his in-processing paperwork on my desk the Friday before, and I spent the weekend not thinking about it, which turned out to be the last weekend I didn't think about Kevin for a very long time. His ERB looked fine. That's his personal record. He'd graduated AIT at Fort Lee, which is where the Army sends 92Gs to learn their job. His PT scores were middling, but passing, no flags. No negative counselings from basic or AIT. He was, on paper, a completely unremarkable private first class. The kind of soldier you get, you train up on your specific DFACs, procedures, and you forget about because they just do their job. There was one thing that caught my eye though, his ASVAB score. The ASVAB is an aptitude test you take before you enlist. It determines what jobs you qualify for. Did anyone else's high school require them to take this out of curiosity? A 92G requires a minimum GT score of 85. Kevin's GT score was 114. That's not Special Forces territory or anything, but it's well above average. It's high enough that Kevin qualified for a lot of jobs that are harder, more technical, and more prestigious than cooking eggs at 4:30 for men who will complain about those eggs no matter what you do to them. I remember looking at that number and thinking, wonder why he picked 92G. Maybe he likes to cook. Maybe his recruiter steered him. I asked him once later. He said, I like food. I still don't know if that was the real answer or just the fewest words that would make me stop asking. With Kevin, both are equally possible. Kevin reported to my DFAC at 5 o'clock on that Tuesday. He was in a clean uniform. His boots were acceptable. He was clean-shaven. He made eye contact. He said sergeant in the right places. He did not seem nervous, which I noted because most new privates are visibly terrified their first day in a real unit, especially at Bragg. Kevin was calm. Kevin smiled. Kevin shook my hand with the confidence of a man who had absolutely no idea what was about to happen to him, which made two of us because I also had no idea what was about to happen to me. I gave Kevin the tour. Every new cook gets the tour. I walk them through the DFAC. I show them the serving line, the kitchen, the dish pit, the walk-in coolers, the walk-in freezer, the dry storage, the office, the cleaning closet, and the grease trap. I show them where the fire extinguishers are. I show them where the first aid kit is. I show them the thermometer log. I explain that we take temperatures on every protein at every stage, and that if a number is wrong, you do not serve it. You do not hide it. You come find me. I explain that the walk-in cooler is organized with ready-to-eat items on the top shelves and raw proteins on the bottom shelves, and that is not a suggestion. I explain that the sanitizer buckets are mixed to a specific concentration using test strips and that we do not eyeball it. Kevin nodded along to all of this. He said, "Roger, Sergeant," at every appropriate pause. He asked one question during the entire tour, which was where the bathroom was. I showed him. He said, "Thank you." I thought this might actually work out. I remember thinking that specifically. I remember the optimism. I wanted to go back to that version of me and warn him, but it would not have mattered. Nothing would have prepared me for Kevin. I've tried to think of what someone could have told me that morning that would have helped me, and there is nothing. There is no briefing for Kevin. It did not work out. I paired Kevin with Specialist Shen for his first shift. Shen had been in my DFAC for 2 years. Solid cook, patient, the kind of guy who could train a new soldier without losing his mind, which is a rarer trait than you'd think. I told Shen to walk Kevin through breakfast prep. Scrambled eggs, bacon, sausage, oatmeal, biscuits, fruit trays, nothing exotic. These are the fundamentals. A 92G learns this in AIT, Advanced Individual Training. Kevin had, presumably, already done this. The first 30 minutes were fine. I checked in twice. Kevin was cracking eggs into the skillet. His technique was sloppy, but functional. Shen was coaching him on heat management, normal new guy stuff. I went back to the office to work on the next week's menu. Shen came to find me 45 minutes later. He didn't knock. He just appeared in the doorway with an expression I have seen on soldiers' faces exactly twice before. Both times in Afghanistan. Both times after something had gone wrong that nobody could explain. He said, "Sergeant, you need to come look at the walk-in." I said, "Is anyone hurt?" He said, "No." I said, "Is anything on fire?" He said, "No, Sergeant, just please come look at the walk-in." I followed him down the hallway. 2 of my other cooks were standing near the cooler door. SPC Torres had her arms crossed. PFC Daniels was leaning against the wall with his hands over his face. Not because he was upset, because he was trying not to laugh in front of me. I could see his shoulders shaking. Shen opened the cooler door. I looked. Kevin had restocked the walk-in. Nobody had asked Kevin to restock the walk-in. Kevin had finished the eggs ahead of schedule, apparently, and decided to be proactive. In theory, this is a good instinct. In practice, what Kevin did was pull 3 cases of raw chicken thighs off the delivery pallet and stack them on the top shelf of the walk-in cooler, directly on top of the prepared fruit trays, the ones we were about to serve, to approximately 300 soldiers in about 90 minutes. Raw chicken carries salmonella. Raw chicken juice drips. If it drips onto the food that's ready to eat, people go to the hospital. This is day 1 material. It is the first thing they teach you in AIT. The walk-in cooler arrangement, which I had explained to Kevin 3 hours ago during his tour, exists specifically and exclusively to prevent this. I looked at Kevin. Kevin looked at me. Kevin was smiling. "I went ahead and restocked, Sergeant," he said. "Figured I'd stay ahead of it." I said, "Kevin, where did I tell you the raw proteins go?" "Bottom shelf, Sergeant." He said it immediately, no hesitation, not guessing. He knew the answer the way you know your own name. I said, "Where did you put the chicken?" Kevin looked at the top shelf. He looked at the chicken. He looked at the fruit trays underneath the chicken. I watched his face for any sign of recognition, any flicker of oh shit. There was nothing. Kevin's face was the face of a man who had been asked what time it was. On the shelf, he said. On which shelf, Kevin? The top shelf. And where do raw proteins go? Bottom shelf, Sergeant. I waited. I have learned through years of supervising soldiers that sometimes you just need to create a silence and let the other person fill it in with the realization of what they've done. It's a technique. It works on most people. Privates especially will crank in about 4 seconds. It did not work on Kevin. Kevin stood in the silence comfortably, like a man waiting for a bus on a nice day, completely unbothered by the contradiction between what he had just said and what he had just done. I could have stood there until retirement. Kevin would have waited with me and not once wondered why we were standing in a cooler staring at chicken. I threw away the fruit trays, all of them, 16 trays, an entire morning's worth of prep. Shen and I re-prepped new ones in 30 minutes, which meant the fruit went out late, which meant the DFAC manager asked me why the fruit was late, which meant I had to explain that my new cook had cross-contaminated the walk-in 3 hours into his first shift. That was the first conversation I had with anyone in my chain of command about Kevin. It was not the last. Torres asked me afterward if Kevin had been drinking. I said no, he hadn't been drinking, he's just new. She gave me a look that said she did not believe that being new explained what she had just seen. She was right, but I didn't know that yet. Shen pulled me aside during the lunch changeover. Shen is not a man who complains. In 2 years, I had never heard him say a negative word about another soldier. He looked at me and said, "Sergeant, I need you to know that I explained the walk-in layout to him twice after you left. I pointed at the shelves, I pointed at the labels, I pointed at the signs that are literally taped to the shelves." He told me he understood. I believed him. I told Shen it wasn't his fault. Shen said he knew that. What he wanted to know was whether this was going to be a regular thing, because if it was, he wanted to be on the record as having reported it. Shen was a smart soldier, smarter than me, maybe, because he was already thinking about covering his ass and I was still in the maybe it was a one-time thing stage. It was not a one-time thing. Kevin's lunch shift that same day produced a second incident, smaller in scale but almost more disturbing in what it revealed. I had Kevin on the serving line. Simple job. Soldier comes through, points at what they want, you put it on the tray. Kevin was on the vegetable station. Green beans, corn, mashed potatoes, a spoon in each container. You scoop, you serve, you say next. This is not complicated. I was watching the line from the end, doing a quality check on portion sizes when I noticed that the mashed potato level was dropping much faster than it should have been. I walked over to Kevin's station. He was serving mashed potatoes with the green bean spoon, and the green beans with the mashed potato spoon. Every single soldier for the last 10 minutes had gotten mashed potatoes with green bean juice on them and green beans with mashed potatoes smeared across the top. I said, "Kevin, you've got the spoons in the wrong containers." He looked down at his hands. He looked at the spoons. He looked at the containers. He switched them. Then he switched them back. I watched him do this. He picked up the spoons, put them in the correct containers, paused for maybe half a second, and then put them back the wrong way. He did this right in front of me, while I was standing there, while I was watching him, while we were making direct eye contact. I said, "Kevin, you just switched them back." He looked down again. He said, "These feel right, Sergeant." I took the spoons out of his hands and put them in the correct containers myself and told him not to move them again. He said, "Roger." He did not move them again. For the rest of that lunch shift, Kevin served vegetables correctly with the correct spoons and did not deviate. Whatever circuit had been misfiring had apparently been reset by direct physical intervention. That was not a mistake. A mistake is putting a spoon in the wrong pot once because you're moving fast and not paying attention. Kevin put the spoons back in the wrong container after I told him they were wrong and after he corrected them himself. He corrected the error and then uncorrected it. His hands knew where the spoons went. His hands just disagreed with reality about which direction correct was. That was the moment I stopped assuming Kevin would figure it out. Not the chicken. The chicken could have been nerves. Everybody makes a bad call their first day, but the spoons were different. The spoons told me that the wiring between Kevin's brain and Kevin's hands had a short in it somewhere, and no amount of explaining was going to find it. I pulled Kevin aside after lunch service and counseled him, verbally, not in writing, because it was his first day and I am not the kind of NCO who paperworks a new soldier on day one for mistakes that could have been nerves. That's what I told myself. In hindsight, I should have started the paper trail right there. I would have saved myself about 3 months. But I was still being fair. I was still giving him the benefit of the doubt that the Army trains you to give. Every soldier can be developed. That's what they tell you at BLC. They were wrong. But they were very confident about it, and I believed them. I explained the cross-contamination issue. I explained the health risk. I explained that people get sick, and that getting people sick in the Army has consequences. Kevin listened. Kevin nodded. Kevin said, "Roger, Sergeant, won't happen again." And then, Kevin said something that stopped me. He said, "I know TBMED 530 says raw poultry needs to be stored at 41 degrees or below and separated from ready-to-eat foods by placement on lower shelving or in separate units to prevent cross-contamination through drip or direct contact." That is a near verbatim quote from the regulation. I checked it later. He was off by 2 words. 2 words in an entire paragraph he apparently had memorized. I said, "If you knew that, why did you put the chicken on the top shelf?" Kevin tilted his head like a dog hearing a strange noise. "I put it where there was room," he said. This was a man who could recite food safety regulations from memory with greater accuracy than most of the NCOs in my building, and who could not or would not connect that knowledge to the physical act of putting a box on a shelf. The information was in his head. It stayed in his head. It did not travel to his hands. I had not seen anything like this before. I have supervised soldiers who didn't know the regs. That's fixable. You teach them. I have supervised soldiers who knew the regs and chose to ignore them. That's a disciplinary action. You counsel them, and if they keep doing it, you chapter them. Kevin was neither of those things. Kevin knew the regs and followed some other set of rules that existed only inside of Kevin's head and bore no relationship to reality. I went home that night and thought about Kevin's ASVAB score. 114 GT. He memorized a regulation paragraph I can't recite from memory, and I've been doing this for years. He graduated AIT. He passed his tests. Someone, somewhere, looked at Kevin and said he was qualified. Kevin put raw chicken on top of fruit salad 3 hours into his first shift. Not because he didn't know better, because knowing better and doing better are, for Kevin, 2 completely separate operations, running on 2 completely separate systems that do not communicate with each other. I started a notebook that night. Green hardcover, the kind they sell at the PX for $3.99. I wrote the date, I wrote what happened, and I wrote who saw it. 2 entries on day 1. Cross-contamination, walk-in cooler, 5:45. Spoon reversal, serving line, 12:15. Shen, Torres, and Daniels for the walk-in. Just me for the spoons. But 3 soldiers in line had commented on the mashed potato situation before I caught it. And I wrote that down too. Kevin's file said he had passed every test the Army put in front of him. Kevin had put raw chicken on top of fruit salad and then uncorrected his own correction on a spoon placement while looking me in the eye. One of these things was lying. I didn't know which one yet, but I was going to need the receipts when someone finally asked. The notebook filled up. I needed a second one. What I knew on the night of September 14th was this. Kevin could quote regulations he could not follow. Kevin could correct errors he would immediately uncorrect. Kevin could look you in the eye, say, "Roger, Sergeant," mean it completely, and then do something no reasonable person would predict. Kevin was not lazy. Kevin was not defiant. Kevin was not stupid in any way I had a framework for. Kevin was something else. Kevin's second day was worse. Part 2. Kevin and the DFAC inspection. Part 1 covered Kevin's first day, the chicken, the spoons, the moment I realized that Kevin could memorize a regulation and then violate it in the same breath without experiencing any apparent contradiction. I should have started paperwork immediately. At the time, I was still operating under the assumption that Kevin was a human being who could be trained, which is an assumption the Army encourages, and which Kevin would spend the next several months disproving. Between Kevin's arrival in September and the events of this post in late October, Kevin had 6 weeks to settle into the DFAC. I'm not going to describe every incident from those 6 weeks because we would be here all day, and also because some of them are hard to explain without diagrams. The short version is that Kevin continued to be Kevin. He knew things he could not do. He could do things he did not know. He was like a textbook that had been printed correctly, but bound in the wrong order. All the pages were there. None of them were where you expected. Some highlights, briefly. Kevin sanitized the prep tables with the floor cleaner and cleaned the floor with the sanitizer. He did this on 3 separate occasions despite the bottles being different colors, different sizes, and labeled in English, which Kevin allegedly speaks and can presumably read. He stored a case of ground beef in the dry storage room because, he explained, the box said keep in a cool, dry place, and the dry storage room had dry in the name. He left a burner on under an empty pot for 40 minutes. When I asked him why there was nothing in the pot, he said he was preheating it. I said, "What are you preheating it for?" He said he didn't know yet, but he wanted it to be ready. Shen, who had been paired with Kevin for 3 of those 6 weeks and was developing a twitch in his left eye that I am not exaggerating about, requested reassignment to the dish pit. I granted it. Shen had earned the dish pit. The dish pit was a reward for surviving Kevin. So that's where we were in late October when my first sergeant called me into his office and informed me that we had a public health command inspection coming in 2 weeks. If you've been in the Army, you know what this means. If you haven't, I'll make it simple. A team from public health comes into your DFAC and checks everything. Temperatures, storage, sanitation, labeling, personal hygiene, pest control, equipment maintenance. They check the things you think they'll check, and then they check the things you didn't know they could check. They use a standardized scorecard. You get a numerical rating. That rating goes to your battalion commander. If the rating is bad, your battalion commander has a conversation with your company commander. Your company commander has a conversation with your first sergeant. Your first sergeant has a conversation with you. None of these conversations are pleasant. My DFAC was solid. We'd scored well in the last 2 inspections. I was not worried about my team. I was worried about Kevin. I went to the LT first, Lieutenant Gordon. He'd been in the unit about 3 months longer than Kevin, which gave him just enough time to have opinions about everything and experience with nothing. He was not a bad officer. I want to be clear about that. He cared. He tried. He just had the confidence of a man who had been told at OCS that he could lead anything, and had not yet discovered the asterisk at the bottom of that assignment. The asterisk says, results may vary when your platoon contains Kevin. I told the LT that Kevin was a risk for the inspection. I explained the pattern. I told him about the chicken, the spoons, the floor cleaner, the ground beef and dry storage, the empty pot. I told him that Kevin could pass any written test you gave him, but could not reliably execute the things the test was about. The LT listened carefully. He took notes. He said, "Sergeant, it sounds like PFC Kevin just needs some focused remedial training. Let's put together a study plan and walk him through mock inspections until he's comfortable with the practical application." I said, "Sir, I've been doing that for 6 weeks." He said, "Well, let's formalize it." So we formalized it. We put Kevin on a 2-week training plan. I wrote it up. Daily study sessions on TBMED 530. Daily hands-on practice with thermometers, sanitizer test strips, and proper storage procedures. Shen, who was the best trainer I had and who I owed several apologies and probably a case of beer, agreed to run the practical sessions. I made flashcards. I'm a grown man, a non-commissioned officer in the United States Army. I made flashcards for a 19-year-old about where chicken goes in a refrigerator. That is what Kevin had reduced me to. Kevin was enthusiastic about the training plan. Kevin loved the flashcards. Kevin studied them on his breaks. I would walk past the break room and see Kevin flipping through the cards with the focus and intensity of a medical student preparing for boards. He quizzed himself. He quizzed other soldiers. He asked Shen follow-up questions, and were honestly pretty good questions. What's the recheck interval if a protein is between 135 and 140 on the first temp? Good question. Correct answer? You recheck in 1 hour, and if it's still below 140, you discard it. Kevin knew this. Kevin knew all of it. At the end of week 1, I gave Kevin a written test. 25 questions. Temperature danger zone, proper storage order, sanitizer concentration, hand-washing procedure, cross-contamination prevention, labeling requirements, cooling procedures for hot foods. Kevin scored 100%, 25 for 25. He didn't even hesitate. He filled it out in 8 minutes and handed it to me and sat back down with the posture of a man who had just completed a routine task, which for Kevin it apparently was. I looked at the test. Every answer was correct. Not just correct, precise. For the question about sanitizer concentration, Kevin didn't just write 200 ppm, he wrote 200 ppm for chlorine-based solution or 400 ppm for quaternary ammonia, per manufacturer specs and test strip verification. That's more detail than I put in the answer key. I stood there looking at this perfect test score for a man who had sanitized the prep tables with floor cleaner 3 times in 6 weeks. And I felt something I had not felt before in my career. I felt like the system was broken in a way I couldn't explain to anyone because no one would believe me. How do you chapter a soldier who scores 100%? How do you tell your commander that this soldier is a danger when his test results say otherwise? Kevin's paperwork was cleaner than some of my best cooks. Kevin's kitchen was a disaster zone. Both of these things were true at the same time, and the Army had no form for that. I scheduled the mock inspection for the following Monday, 4 days before the real one. The mock inspection is where I needed to slow down because this is where things went sideways. I set it up as close to the real thing as I could. I walked the DFAC the way the inspectors would. I started with the walk-in cooler. The temperatures, correct. Storage order, correct. Everything labeled with date and time. Kevin had done this. Kevin had done it perfectly. I checked every label. Every date was accurate. I opened the reach-in cooler. Same thing. Perfect. I was, for approximately 90 seconds, experiencing something close to hope. Then I got to the prep area. Kevin was at his station prepping chicken for lunch. He was wearing gloves. He had his thermometer. He had his sanitizer bucket at the correct concentration. I know it was correct because I watched him mix it and test it that morning, and the strip came back right. Kevin's station was textbook. I said, "Kevin, show me your hand wash procedure." Kevin walked to the sink. He turned on the water. He wet his hands. He applied soap. He scrubbed for 20 seconds. I counted. He hit 20. He rinsed. He dried with a paper towel. He used the paper towel to turn off the faucet. Perfect technique. Textbook. I said, "Good. Go back to your prep." Kevin walked back to his station. He picked up the raw chicken with his bare hands. He was not wearing gloves. His gloves were on the prep table where he had taken them off to wash his hands, and he had not put them back on. He picked up raw chicken, barehanded, immediately after a textbook perfect hand wash, and began cutting it on the prep surface. I said, "Kevin, gloves." He looked at his hands. He looked at the chicken in his hands. He set the chicken down. He put on gloves. He picked the chicken back up. He did not wash his hands again first. He just put the gloves on over the hands that had just been handling raw chicken. The gloves were now contaminated on the inside, which meant his hands were going to be contaminated when he took the gloves off, which meant everything he touched after that was contaminated. I want to be clear. The hand wash was perfect. The execution of what came after the hand wash existed in a parallel universe where hand washing and food handling are unrelated activities that just so happen to sometimes occur in the same room. I stopped the mock inspection. I pulled Kevin aside. This was the first time my voice was louder than it needed to be, and I am not proud of it. But I am also not going to pretend it didn't happen. I said, Kevin, what was the point of washing your hands? He said, to remove contaminants and bacteria before handling food or after handling raw proteins, Sergeant. I said, and what did you just do after washing your hands? He said, I went back to prep, Sergeant. What did you handle at prep? Chicken, Sergeant. With what? He paused. He looked at his hands. He was still wearing the contaminated gloves. Gloves, Sergeant. Did you put the gloves on before or after you touched the chicken? Another pause, longer. I watched his face. This was not the face of a man who had been caught cutting corners. This was the face of a man trying to reconstruct a sequence of events that had already left his memory. Kevin was not being evasive. Kevin genuinely could not remember what he had done 30 seconds ago. It had already fallen out of him. I think after, Sergeant. You think? Yes, Sergeant. Kevin, do you see the problem? I should have put the gloves on first, Sergeant. Yes. Roger, Sergeant. He said it in the way he always said it. Calm, agreeable, completely sincere, completely useless. He understood the principle. He would violate the principle again tomorrow, not out of defiance, not out of laziness, because the understanding and the doing were stored in different rooms in Kevin's head, and there was no hallway between them. I wrote up the mock inspection results. I gave them to the LT. The LT read them and said, but he passed the written test. I said, yes, sir. Scored 100%. Yes, sir. And then he handled raw chicken with his bare hands? Yes, sir. The LT sat with that for a moment. I could see him trying to fit Kevin into a category. Soldier who doesn't know the material, retrain. Soldier who doesn't care about the material, discipline. Soldier who knows the material perfectly and then does the opposite? The LT did not have a box for that. Nobody does. I had been looking for that box for 6 weeks. He said, what do you recommend, Sergeant? I said, sir, I recommend we keep Kevin off the floor during the inspection. The LT said he'd think about it. What happened next is that the LT talked to First Sergeant Hensley, and First Sergeant Hensley decided that hiding Kevin during the inspection was not what leaders do, and that every soldier in the DFAC would be present and accounted for and performing their duties because that is the standard, and we do not deviate from that standard. I respected First Sergeant Hensley. He was a good First Sergeant. He'd been in the Army for 18 years and had run the DFACs at 3 duty stations. He had the experience to back up his decisions. What he did not have was 6 weeks of watching Kevin. I had my counseling statements. He had my reports. He had the LT's summary. But reading about Kevin is not the same as watching Kevin. Reading about Kevin makes you think there must be an explanation. Watching Kevin makes you realize there truly isn't one. The inspection was on Friday. I put Kevin on the serving line because it was the lowest risk position I could justify. All he had to do was stand behind the counter and put food on trays. The cooks had already prepared everything. Kevin just had to scoop and serve. I put Shen on the station next to him. I told Shen that his only job that day was to watch Kevin. Shen looked at me with the eyes of a man who had been asked to jump on a grenade and said, Roger. The inspectors arrive at 6:30. 2 of them. They started in the back. Walk-in, reach-in, dry storage, dish pit, grease trap, all clean, all correct. My team had done their jobs. I followed the inspectors through the back of the house and everything was green. I started to relax. We were going to be fine. We just had to get through the serving line. The lead inspector stopped at Kevin's station. Kevin was serving scrambled eggs. Kevin was wearing gloves. Kevin's station was clean. Kevin's serving utensils was in the correct position. The inspector checked the temperature of the eggs in the serving pan. 165 degrees. Correct. The inspector said, how often do you check holding temps on the line? Kevin said, every hour or when a new batch is brought up, whichever comes first. Correct. I exhaled. The inspector said, and what's the minimum holding temperature for hot foods? Kevin said, 135 degrees. Correct. The inspector made a note. The inspector moved on to the next station. I nearly felt relief. Then, Kevin unprompted to the inspector's back, said, "But honestly, we don't always hit 135 right away when a new batch comes out because the serving pans lose heat on the transfer from the kitchen, so sometimes it takes a few minutes to come back up." The inspector stopped walking. I stopped breathing. The inspector turned around. He said, "Can you say that again?" Kevin said it again. Happily. In full. With additional detail. Kevin explained, accurately and in considerable technical detail, the heat loss phenomenon that occurs when food is transferred from the cooking vessel to the serving pan, which is a real thing that happens in every DFAC on the planet, and which every DFAC on the planet handles by checking temps after transferring and not serving until the food is at the correct temperature, which is exactly what we did, which Kevin knew, and which Kevin had decided to share with the inspector as though we were reporting a systematic failure instead of describing a routine part of food service that we managed correctly every single day. The inspector spent the next 20 minutes at Kevin's station asking follow-up questions. Kevin answered every single one of them correctly. Kevin described our procedures accurately. Kevin was, in the strictest factual sense, telling the truth about everything. He was also, by volunteering information that didn't need to be volunteered in the way he volunteered it, making it sound like our DFAC was held together with duct tape and hope. Kevin was not lying. Kevin was doing something worse than lying. Kevin was providing accurate information with no awareness of how it sounded. Shen, standing 6 feet away, had gone completely still. I have seen that exact posture in a deer caught in headlights. He was trying to become invisible. I wished to join him. We passed the inspection. Barely. Our score dropped 11 points from the previous quarter. The inspector noted inconsistent understanding of food safety principle among line staff. In the remarks section, which I promise you was about Kevin specifically because every other cook in my DFAC could do their jobs in their sleep. First Sergeant Hensley called me into his office that afternoon. He had the inspection report on his desk. He looked at it. He looked at me. He said, "Tell me about PFC, Kevin." I talked for 20 minutes. I brought the notebook. I brought the counseling statements. I brought Kevin's perfect written test and the mock inspection results side by side. I laid it out the way I'm laying it out to you. First Sergeant sat there and listened, and when I was done, he said, "So he knows the material." I said, "First Sergeant, he knows the material better than some of my NCOs. But he can't do the job." He can tell you exactly how to do the job, but no, he cannot do the job. First Sergeant leaned back in his chair and said something I will not forget. He said, "I've been in the Army for 18 years and I have never had a soldier I couldn't train or couldn't chapter. You're telling me you've got one who passes every test and fails every task?" I said, "First Sergeant, I am telling you exactly that." He stared at the inspection report for a long time. Then he said, "Keep documenting. I'll take this to the commander." That was the first time anyone above me acknowledged that Kevin might be a problem the system wasn't built to solve. It was late October. Kevin had been in my DFAC for 6 weeks. He had a perfect test score, a stack of counseling statements, and an ASVAB that said he should have been doing something more complicated than cooking eggs. Nothing added up. None of it made sense. And I still had to put him on the line Monday morning because the paperwork to do anything else moved at a speed that made Kevin look efficient. I went home that night and wrote 3 pages in the notebook. I thought that by keeping a record, I'd be able to make sense of it all at some point. I still haven't made any sense of it, just for the record. Kevin's next trick involved the grease trap. But I need a minute before I tell that one. DFAC Kevin goes to the field, Part 3. I promised the grease trap story, so here it is. A grease trap is exactly what it sounds like. It's a tank that sits between the kitchen drains and the sewer line, and its job is to catch the grease in food solids before they hit the pipes. If you maintain it, it works. If you don't maintain it, it backs up. And when it backs up, your DFAC smells like something died inside something else that also died. Grease trap maintenance is not glamorous. You open it, You skim the grease layer off the top. You check the baffles. You hose it down. It's a 2-person job, and it takes about 30 minutes. We did it every other week. I assigned Kevin to grease trap duty with Torres. Torres was not happy about this. Torres had been avoiding Kevin since the walk-in incident, and I could not blame her. But I also could not let Kevin hide from every task in the DFAC because there would be no tasks left. Torres was competent and direct, and I thought she'd be a good match because she would not let Kevin drift. I told Torres the task. I told her the procedure. I told Kevin the task. I told Kevin the procedure. I told them both to come get me when they were done. Torres came to get me 40 minutes later. She was wet. Not damp, wet. Her uniform was soaked from the waist down and she smelled like the inside of a grease trap, which she had recently been inside of, in a manner of speaking. She said, and I am paraphrasing because Torres had a vocabulary that would have gotten her a counseling statement if an officer had been present. She said that Kevin had opened the grease trap, looked inside, decided it was too full to skim from the top, and attempted to drain it by pulling what he had described as the plug at the bottom. There is no plug at the bottom. What there is a cleanout cap on the outflow pipe, which is not designed to be removed during maintenance, which is designed to be removed by a plumber with the appropriate tools and a plan, and which Kevin removed with a pipe wrench he had gotten from somewhere that Torres still could not explain. The contents of the grease trap, which at that point consisted of approximately 2 weeks of accumulated kitchen grease, food particles, and water that could be described as gray only if you were being generous, exited through the pipe and onto the concrete pad where Torres was standing. Kevin was dry. Kevin had been standing on the other side of the trap when this happened. Kevin said he didn't know why it came out so fast. I asked Kevin where he got the pipe wrench. He said the maintenance closet. I asked him why he thought removing a pipe fitting was part of grease trap maintenance. He said it seemed like the most efficient way to empty it. I asked him if anyone had ever trained him to do that. He said no, but it made sense to him because that's how you drain a bathtub. A grease trap is not a bathtub. I should not have to say this. I should not have to explain to a grown man in uniform that a grease trap and a bathtub operate on different principles. But here I was, standing next to a puddle of rancid grease explaining it to Kevin while Torres dripped. Torres, to her credit, did not murder Kevin. She stood there and dripped and stared at a point roughly 6 inches above Kevin's head and said nothing. Later, she told me that she had been doing a breathing exercise she learned from her therapist. She said it was the first time she'd ever used it for its intended purpose. I cleaned up the grease myself because it was my DFAC and my soldier and my mess. It took an hour, and the concrete pad smelled like a deep fryer's nightmare for a week. The plumber, who came to reset the cleanout cap, looked at the wrench marks on the fitting and asked me how the cap came off. I said one of my soldiers removed it. He said, with what? I said a pipe wrench. He said those caps are usually hand tight, but sometimes they seize, and you'd need significant force to break one free. He asked if the soldier had plumbing experience. I said no. He said, well, he's strong enough to be a plumber. Maybe look into that. I wrote the counseling statement that afternoon. Written this time, not verbal. It was Kevin's third written counseling in 2 months, and the one that I hand-carried to First Sergeant Hensley with my recommendation that Kevin be flagged for a performance chapter. First Sergeant looked at it, looked at the previous 2, looked at the notebook, and said he'd bring it to the commander. He also said, the field exercise is in 2 weeks. Is he going? He was going. Everyone was going. That's how field exercises work. I want to take a second here to explain what I was dealing with in terms of chapter process, because I think people assume you can just fire someone in the military. You cannot. Chaptering a soldier, even for performance, requires documentation, counseling statements, a formal performance improvement plan, evidence that you gave the soldier every opportunity to improve and that they failed to meet the standard despite your efforts. The Army bends over backwards to keep soldiers in because training a replacement costs money. And the assumption built into the system is that leadership can fix any soldier if they try hard enough. The system was not built for Kevin. The system was built for soldiers who are lazy or undisciplined or undertrained. Kevin was none of those things. Kevin was a new category and the paperwork hadn't caught up. So Kevin went to the field. Our unit's field exercise was a 10-day training event at one of the range complexes on post. The infantry and support elements would be running their lanes and our job was to feed them. That meant setting up and operating the MKT, which is the mobile kitchen trailer. The MKT is a towable kitchen that runs on diesel-powered burners. It has griddles, ovens, steam tables, and water heaters. When it's set up correctly, you can feed a company out of it 3 times a day. When it's set up incorrectly, you can set the tree line on fire. I have seen both. The MKT is not complicated if you follow the TM, which is the technical manual. You position it on level ground, you deploy the side panels, you connect the fuel line, you prime the burners, you light the burners in sequence, you verify the flame pattern, you check for leaks. Every step matters. The fuel line carries diesel. The burners produce an open flame. If you skip a step or do a step wrong, the best case is the MKT doesn't work. The worst case is the kind of thing that ends up in a safety briefing for the rest of the army with someone's name redacted. I put Kevin on the setup team because I wanted him where I could see him. I was running setup. 4 soldiers, including Kevin. I walked the team to the TM, step by step. We'd done this in the DFAC parking lot as a rehearsal the week before. Kevin had performed adequately during the rehearsal, which I noted with the guarded optimism of a man who had been burned before but was contractually obligated to keep trying. We got the MKT positioned, we deployed the panels, we connected the fuel line. This is the part where things happen. I had Kevin on burner setup. His job was to prime the number 2 burner and verify the fuel flow before we lit it. The procedure is, open the fuel valve a quarter turn, wait for fuel to reach the burner head, check for leaks at every fitting. If there are no leaks, signal ready. If there are leaks, close the valve and report. Kevin opened the fuel valve. He did not open it a quarter turn. He opened it all the way, full flow. Diesel flooded the burner pan and started pooling underneath the MKT. PFC Daniels, who was standing 3 feet away lighting the number 1 burner, saw the pool spreading toward him and jumped back. He yelled. I yelled. Kevin stood there watching the diesel pool with the expression of a man observing a mildly interesting puddle of magical piss. I closed the valve. I got everyone back. I checked for ignition sources. We were fine. The number 1 burner was already lit, but Daniels had pulled back far enough that the pooled diesel didn't reach the flame. If he had been 2 seconds slower, or if the wind had been blowing toward him instead of across, I would be telling a different kind of story. I would be telling it to an investigation board instead of the internet. Kevin said he thought more fuel meant the burner would light faster. I want to be very specific about what happened next because I want to ensure the sequence on the record even while writing it here. I pulled Kevin off the MKT. I told Daniels to take over the number 2 burner. I walked Kevin 30 meters away from the setup area. I stood in front of him. I asked him to tell me the procedure for priming a burner. He told me, correctly, quarter turn, wait for fuel flow, check for leaks. He recited it like he was reading from the technical manual. I asked him why he opened the valve all the way. He said, I figured more fuel would make it go faster, Sergeant. I said, Kevin, you just told me the procedure is a quarter turn. He said, right, Sergeant. And you opened it all the way. Yes, Sergeant. Those are 2 different things. Kevin thought about this. Not for long. I thought it would still work, Sergeant, just faster. That was the moment I stopped being patient and started being something else. Not angry. Anger implies I thought Kevin was doing this on purpose, and I had given up on that theory months ago. What I was, standing in a field at Fort Bragg at 6 o'clock in November with diesel drying on the ground and Daniel still shaking, was afraid. I was afraid of Kevin, not of Kevin the person. Kevin the person was polite and would not hurt anyone on purpose. I was afraid of Kevin the variable. Kevin, the thing I could not predict. Kevin, the gap in every precaution I took. I had followed every procedure. I had trained him. I had rehearsed with him. I had given him one job. He could tell me exactly how to do that job. He did it wrong anyway, and someone nearly caught fire because of it. I wrote the counseling statement in the cab of the supply truck while my team finished the MKT setup without Kevin. I used the serious incident box. I described the fuel spill. I described the proximity to the active flame. I described the potential consequences in plain language because I was done being diplomatic about it. I had Kevin sign it. He signed it without hesitation and without reading it, which bothered me almost as much as the diesel. For the rest of the field exercise, I kept Kevin on the serving line and on cleanup. No burners, no fuel, no equipment that could injure, ignite, or explode. Kevin's job was to serve food, wash pans, and stay where someone could see him. This worked for 3 days. On the morning of the third day, something happened that I still think about. We had a generator issue. The portable generator that powered our lights and the water heater had been running rough since day 1, and on the morning of day 3, it died. My soldiers are cooks, not mechanics. I called it into the support platoon and was told the mechanic would be out when available, which in field exercise language means sometime between now and never. Without the water heater, we couldn't sanitize dishes to standard. Without sanitized dishes, we couldn't serve the next meal. Kevin was standing near the generator when it died. He walked over to it. He looked at it for about 30 seconds. Then he took off the air filter cover, pulled out the filter, tapped it against his boot a few times, checked the spark plug, pulled it, cleaned it on his shirt, put it back, and reprimed the fuel line. He pulled the starter cord, and the generator coughed back to life. I watched this happen. Torres watched this happen. We looked at each other. I said, "Kevin, how did you know how to do that?" He said, "My dad has one of these for his house. It does this all the time. Dirty filter, fouled plug. It's fixed." He said it like it was nothing. Like he hadn't just diagnosed and fixed a mechanical problem in 2 minutes that I would have waited 3 hours for a mechanic to look at. His hands had moved with a confidence and precision I had never seen from him in the kitchen. He didn't hesitate. He didn't second guess. He just fixed it. And then, 30 minutes later, he served oatmeal with a serving spoon instead of a ladle for 15 soldiers straight before anyone noticed. That's Kevin. That is the entire Kevin problem in one morning. The man who can rebuild a generator by feel and cannot select the proper utensils required to do the job he is assigned to. The man whose ASVAB says 114 and whose presence in the kitchen means pray. I stopped trying to understand the pattern after that morning because there is no pattern. Kevin is not inconsistent in a way that reveals an underlying logic. Kevin is inconsistent in a way that suggests there are multiple Kevins taking shifts and none of them talk or even just leave notes to each other. On the fourth day, Kevin got lost. We were operating out of a tactical assembly area that was maybe 400 meters across. You could stand in the middle of it and see every edge. The MKT was in the center. The latrines were on the north side, about a 5-minute walk. The tents were on the south side. The road was on the east. Kevin went to the latrine after lunch service and did not come back. After 30 minutes, I sent Daniels to check on him. Daniels came back alone. Kevin was not at the latrine. Kevin was not in the tents. Kevin was not at the MKT. Kevin was not anywhere in the assembly area. I reported a missing soldier. I need you to understand the weight of that. A missing soldier on a military training exercise triggers a response. People start looking. Leadership gets notified. The exercise pauses. Range control gets involved. It is not a small thing. It's the kind of thing that generates phone calls to the company commander, who generates phone calls to the battalion commander, who is now aware that your DFAC lost a cook on a range complex that is smaller than some shopping malls. We found Kevin 45 minutes later. He was 600 meters south of the assembly area, on the other side of a wood line, sitting on a log. He was eating a packet of peanut butter from an MRE that he had apparently taken from the supply point on his way to wherever he thought he was going. He was calm. He was not distressed. He did not appear to know he was lost. I said, "Kevin, where were you going?" He said, "The latrine, Sergeant." "The latrine is north. You went south." "I thought it was this way." "You've been going to the same latrine for 4 days." Kevin looked around. He looked at the trees. He looked back at me. "These all look the same, Sergeant." He was not wrong. Trees do look the same, but the latrine had a path, and the path started 10 meters from the MKT, and the path did not go through a wood line, and Kevin had used the exact path 8 times in 4 days. For whatever reason, this time he went south. He went through the woods. Then he chose to sit on a log and eat peanut butter. He did not think to turn around when the path disappeared because I think Kevin did not notice the path had disappeared. Kevin just kept on walking. First Sergeant Hensley was in the assembly area when we brought Kevin back. He had come to check on the feeding operation and had arrived in time to witness the search. He stood there, with his arms crossed, watching Kevin walk out of the woodline with peanut butter on his chin and an expression of mild curiosity about why everyone seemed upset. First Sergeant looked at me. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. 6 weeks ago, he had told me he'd never had a soldier he couldn't train or chapter. He was looking at Kevin walk back from being lost in an area you couldn't get lost in. And I watched the last piece of that belief flicker and die right there on his face. After the field exercise, things moved faster. First Sergeant pushed the chapter recommendation to the commander. The commander pushed it to legal. Legal pushed back and asked for more documentation. Because legal always asks for more documentation. Because the file has to be airtight before they'll process a performance separation, and Kevin's file was the strangest one anyone had seen. Perfect test scores, catastrophic practical performance, an ASVAB that didn't match the soldier. Counseling statements that read like a hallucination of some sort, but there were witnesses and signatures on every one. The legal review added roughly 6 weeks to the timeline. Kevin was still mine. Kevin was still in the DFAC every morning at 500. Kevin was still saying, "Roger, Sergeant," and meaning it, and doing something else entirely. December. Kevin had been in my DFAC for 3 months. I had used most of the notebook. Maybe I had already moved on to the second one, I can't truly remember. The system was moving. Slowly. The notebooks helped me put a handle on this Kevin that continued to defy all logic or explanation. Oh shit, this is also about the time that Kevin did the thing with the thermometer. That's part 4. That's the one that broke First Sergeant. Soldiers went to the hospital, all because I made a singular oversight. Kevin's DFAC secret. Part 4. December at the Bragg is not cold by any real standard, but it's cold enough that soldiers complain, which means they eat more. Which means the DFAC is busier, which means more food moving through the kitchen, which means more opportunities for Kevin. I've been managing Kevin for 3 months. Managing is a generous word. I had been containing Kevin. The chapter paperwork was with legal. First Sergeant Hensley was pushing it. The commander was on board. The system was moving at the speed the system moves, which is slowly. And Kevin was still in my DFAC every morning at 5 o'clock because the Army does not let you bench a soldier while the paperwork processes. Kevin was still working. Kevin was still mine. After the field exercise, I had put Kevin on what I privately called the minimum damage rotation. Serving line, dish pit, dry storage inventory. Tasks where the worst case scenario was a mess, not a casualty. I had pulled him off all cooking, all prep involving raw proteins, and anything that required operating equipment with a fuel source. The LT asked me if I was developing Kevin or just warehousing him. I said both, sir, simultaneously, and he looked at me like he wanted to argue but didn't have the ammunition. The thermometer thing happened on a Wednesday. I know it was a Wednesday because Wednesday was our chicken day. We served fried chicken for lunch on Wednesdays. It was the one meal that soldiers actually looked forward to, which meant it was the one meal I could not afford to have go wrong, which means you already know where this is going. Here's what happened. I need to explain the thermometer calibration process first because the details matter. Every DFAC has probe thermometers, dial type, with a metal stem you stick into the food to check the internal temperature. These thermometers drift over time. The readings get inaccurate, so you calibrate them. The standard method is the ice point method. You fill a container with ice water, submerge the probe, wait for the needle to stabilize, and it should read 32 degrees Fahrenheit. If it doesn't read 32, you use the calibration nut on the back of the dial to adjust it until it does. Simple procedure. We calibrate every thermometer at the start of every shift. It takes about 2 minutes per thermometer. I had been doing the calibration myself since the field exercise because I did not trust Kevin with anything that affected food safety readings. On this particular Wednesday, I was late to the DFAC. My car wouldn't start, a dead battery. I got there at 5:20 instead of 4:50, which meant the morning prep was already underway when I walked in. Shen was running things. Shen was reliable. I was not worried. What I didn't know was that Kevin had arrived at 4:45, 15 minutes before anyone else, which was unusual because Kevin was always exactly on time. Never early, never late. Kevin arrived early, saw that the thermometers had not been calibrated yet, and decided to do it himself. I want to pause here to say something. Kevin deciding to calibrate the thermometers on his own initiative was, in a vacuum, the correct thing to do. Thermometers needed to be calibrated. They had not been calibrated. Kevin knew the procedure. Kevin was, in his mind, being helpful. He was being proactive the same way he had been proactive with the chicken in the walk-in on his first day. Kevin's instinct to take initiative was not the problem. Kevin's execution of that initiative was the problem. Kevin's execution of everything was the problem. Kevin filled a container with ice water. Correct. Kevin waited for the needle to stabilize. Correct. The needle settled at 36 degrees. This meant the thermometer was reading 4 degrees high. The correct adjustment is to turn the calibration nut until the needle moves down to 32 degrees. Kevin turned the calibration nut the wrong direction. He moved the needle up to 40. Now the thermometer was reading 8 degrees higher than actual temperature. Kevin did this to 3 thermometers. All 3 were now off by 8 degrees in the same direction. Kevin put them back in the thermometer rack and went to start his serving line setup, satisfied that he had contributed. Shen did not catch this, because Shen had no reason to check the calibration. The thermometers were in the rack. They looked normal. The calibration log had not been filled out, which should have been a flag, but the morning was busy, and Shen was covering my duties and his own, and the log got missed. I got there at 5:20 and went straight into the office to handle the administration I'd missed. I did not check the thermometers. I assumed they'd been done because they were always done. That was my mistake. I own that. I should have verified. I did not verify because for 3 months I had been the one doing it. And the one morning I wasn't there, Kevin was. The chicken went into the fryers at 10:30. At 11:15, the cook on fryer duty pulled the first batch and temped it. The temperature read 165. He logged it. Correct procedure, except the actual temperature of that chicken was about 157. At 157, chicken is probably fine. Probably. The USDA says 165 for a reason, and that reason is that 165 kills salmonella instantly. Below that, you need to hold it at temperature for a longer time to achieve the same kill rate. At 157, you need to hold for about 30 seconds. If the chicken went straight from the fryer to the serving line to a tray to a soldier's mouth, it might not have had that hold time. Might. The second batch came out at 11:45. The fryer temperature had dropped slightly because of how much chicken was cycling through. Second batch temped at 161 on the bad thermometer. Actual temp? About 153. That is below the safety threshold by any standard. By 12:30, approximately 200 soldiers had eaten fried chicken for lunch. By 1800, 6 p.m., 14 of them were in the aid station with symptoms consistent with foodborne illness. Vomiting, diarrhea, one soldier had a fever of 102. 3 of them from the 82nd. One was a staff sergeant who had apparently gone back for seconds. The aid station called the DFAC. The DFAC manager called me. I called First Sergeant Hensley. First Sergeant Hensley said a word I will not type and told me to shut the DFAC down and secure all the food from lunch service. I pulled everything, every pan, every tray, every container. I bagged and labeled it. I pulled the fryer oil for testing. I pulled the thermometers. I did this by the book because I knew what was coming, and I knew that if one step was missed, the investigation would find that step before it found the actual problem. Shen helped. Torres helped. Kevin stood by the serving line and watched with the expression of a man observing a moderately interesting documentary about someone else's life. By 1900, 7 p.m., I was in the company commander's office with First Sergeant Hensley, the DFAC manager, and a representative from Public Health who had been called in to investigate. The thermometers had been pulled. They tested all three against a known reference. All three were off by 8 degrees. The calibration log was blank for that morning. The fryer temperature logs showed a downward trend across the lunch service that nobody had flagged because the thermometer readings looked correct. The public health investigator asked me who had calibrated the thermometers that morning. I told him. He asked me if PFC Kevin had been trained on the ice point method. I said yes. He asked me if PFC Kevin had demonstrated competence in the ice point method. I opened my mouth and closed it again. The commander was watching me. First Sergeant was watching me. The DFAC manager was watching me. They were all waiting for me to say yes, so that this could be a simple training failure, a one-time lapse, something the system knows how to process. A soldier made a mistake. Additional training will be provided. Corrective action taken. Case closed. That's the story the Army knows how to tell. I could not say yes. I could not say that Kevin had demonstrated competence because I had never let Kevin calibrate a thermometer. Because I knew Kevin could not be trusted with tasks that affected food safety. Because I had been doing the calibration myself for exactly this reason. And the one morning I wasn't there, Kevin had done what Kevin always does, which is take initiative and do it wrong. I said, "Sir, PFC Kevin was trained on the procedure. He can recite the procedure from memory. I had not authorized him to perform calibrations independently." The room got quiet in the way rooms get quiet when everyone present realizes that the answer they just heard is worse than the answer they were expecting. That night, First Sergeant Hensley sat in the DFAC office after everyone else had left. I was writing my statement. I was reading the investigation summary. He got to the part about the calibration direction. He got to the part where Kevin turned the nut the wrong way on 3 separate thermometers, which means he had 3 opportunities to notice the needle was moving away from 32 and not toward it. And he didn't notice on any of them because Kevin does not check his work. Kevin has never checked his work. Kevin completes the steps and moves on with the confidence of a man who has never been wrong, despite being wrong constantly. First Sergeant put the paper down. He took off his glasses. He put his head in his hands and he sat like that for a long time. And he said, "Get me his recruiting file." That's how the ASVAB investigation started. I'm going to shift gears here because the thermometer incident is what happened, but the recruiting file is what explained it, or didn't explain it, or explained it in a way that made everything worse. I put in the request through the S1 shop. Took about a week. What came back was Kevin's enlistment packet, which included his ASVAB score sheet, his recruiter's notes, and his physical and psychological screening from MEPS, the Military Entrance Processing Station. I also made phone calls. I called the recruiting station that processed Kevin. I talked to a sergeant first class who had not personally recruited Kevin, but who remembered Kevin's recruiter. A staff sergeant who had since had a permanent change of station to Fort Campbell. I got the staff sergeant on the phone. I told him who I was. I told him I had one of his recruits. I told him the name. There was a pause. A long one, the kind of pause where you can hear the person on the other end deciding how much they want to be involved in whatever you're about to tell them. Then he said, "The cook?" I said, "Yes." He said, "How's he doing?" I said, "He put 14 soldiers in the aid station." Another pause. And he said, "Yeah, that tracks." "What do you mean that tracks?" "Look, Sergeant, I'm not going to sit here and tell you I knew Kevin was going to be a problem, but I'm not going to tell you I'm surprised either." I asked him what happened at MEPS. He got careful. Recruiters get careful when you start asking about MEPS because nobody wants to be the guy who put a bad soldier in the army. It reflects on their numbers, it reflects on their station, it reflects on them. So he was careful, but he talked. Because at this point, Kevin had already put people in the hospital, and careful only gets you so far. What came out of that conversation and the file review was this. Kevin tested at MEPS on a Tuesday. His raw ASVAB scores were unremarkable. GT of 191, enough for a 92G, but not by much. Kevin was set to enlist as a 92G with a GT of 91, and that should have been the end of it. But Kevin's MEPS test was flagged for a retest because of a timing irregularity, something about how fast he completed one of the sections. I don't know the exact details because the recruiter was vague about it, which tells me the details were not flattering to anyone involved. Kevin retested. On the retest, his GT jumped to 114, a 23-point increase. 23 points is a significant jump. Not unheard of, but significant. It can happen if someone had test anxiety the first time. It can happen if someone studied. It can happen if someone was coached on what to expect between tests. The recruiter said Kevin studied. He said he gave Kevin some practice materials, and Kevin went home and came back a week later and crushed it. He said Kevin was real good at tests and just needed to see the format once. I believed that. I believe Kevin is real good at tests. I believe Kevin can look at a standardized format, absorb the pattern, and reproduce it. Kevin could probably score higher than 114 if he took it a third time. Kevin's brain, whatever else is going on with it, can recognize patterns in a controlled, written, multiple-choice environment and produce the correct answers. Kevin's brain cannot take those patterns and apply them to a kitchen, or a grease trap, or a fuel valve, or a thermometer. The information goes in, the test answers come out, the connection to physical reality does not exist. The psychological screening at MEPS was clean, nothing flagged. Kevin answered the questions correctly, which of course he did, because the questions were on paper, and Kevin is undefeated on paper. The screening saw a young man with a good score, no red flags, and a desire to cook. There was no reason to dig deeper. The system is designed to catch people who can't pass the test, not people who can only pass the test. I brought all of this to First Sergeant Hensley. I laid it out. The original test score, the retest, the jump, the recruiter's explanation, the clean screening. First Sergeant read it all. He sat with it for a while. Then he said, "So there's nothing wrong with him." I said, "First Sergeant, there is clearly something wrong with him." On paper. On paper, no. On paper, he's a model soldier who tests well and has an unfortunate pattern of practical errors. And we can't chapter someone for testing too well. No, First Sergeant. We're chaptering him for performance. Yes, First Sergeant. The pattern of failures, the food safety incident, the counseling statements, it's all documented. Legal is going to ask why a soldier with a 114 GT and a 100% on a food safety exam is being separated for inability to perform his duties. I know, First Sergeant. And your answer? My answer is the notebook, First Sergeant. My answer is 14 soldiers in the aid station. My answer is that the Army does not have a test for whatever Kevin is. And until it does, the only evidence that Kevin cannot do this job is the trail of things Kevin has done while doing this job. First Sergeant nodded. He said, "I'll make sure legal understands." He paused. "You know this is going to take another 2 months." I said, "I know, First Sergeant. He's still yours until then." "I know, First Sergeant." I went home that night and sat in my truck in the driveway for a while before I went inside. My wife texted me, asking if I was coming in. I said, "Give me a minute." I was trying to figure out what I could have done differently with Kevin, and I could not come up with an answer. I trained him. I documented everything. I paired him with my best soldiers. I followed every regulation and every procedure the Army has for developing underperforming soldiers. I made flashcards. I ran mock inspections. I gave him written tests that he aced and practical tasks that he failed in the same afternoon. Kevin beat all of it. Not because he was fighting me, because Kevin is something the system was not built to handle. Kevin is a test-taking machine attached to a body that operates independently of the machine. The machine is excellent. The body is a hazard. The recruiter wasn't wrong. Kevin is real good at tests. Kevin might be one of the best test takers I've ever met. If the Army evaluated soldiers purely on written examinations, Kevin would promote ahead of schedule. Kevin would be a sergeant before me. Kevin would be running a DFAC. That thought kept me up at night. It shouldn't have, but it did. The ASVAB didn't explain Kevin, it explained how Kevin got in. Getting Kevin out was going to take the rest of the winter. In the meantime, Kevin was still showing up every morning, still saying, "Roger, Sergeant," still doing his best, which was the most terrifying part because Kevin's best was unpredictable, and Kevin's worst was identical to Kevin's best. There was no gear shift. There was no telltale sign that today was going to be a Kevin day, because every day was a Kevin day. You just didn't always find out until the damage was done. I kept him on dish pit for the rest of December, washing dishes, the simplest job in the DFAC. Kevin washed dishes adequately. Not well, not badly, adequately. He broke 2 plates in 3 weeks, which is actually below the average for the dish pit, so there's that. Kevin was, for the first and possibly only time in his Army career, performing at standard. It only took removing him from every other task in the building. Part 5 is the last one. It should be easier to write than this one was. DFAC Kevin's Last Meal. Part 5. The chapter went through in February. It took longer than First Sergeant said it would because, of course it did. Legal kicked it back twice. The first time was a formatting issue on one of the counseling statements. The second time was because legal wanted a statement from the public health investigator confirming that the thermometer incident was attributable to Kevin and not to a systematic failure in DFAC oversight. That one stung because the implication was that maybe this was my fault. Maybe my leadership had failed. Maybe the system had worked fine and I had dropped the ball. The public health investigator provided his statement. It attributed the incident to Kevin. But the fact that the question was asked tells you everything about how the Army processes a soldier like Kevin. The system would rather believe that leadership failed than believe that a soldier with a 114 GT and a perfect test score is simply incapable of doing his job. A bad leader is a problem the Army knows how to fix. Kevin is not. The chapter was approved under Chapter 13, which is separation from unsatisfactory performance. Kevin would receive a general discharge under honorable conditions. Not a bad conduct discharge, not a dishonorable. A general, which meant Kevin would keep most of his benefits, which meant, as far as the paperwork was concerned, Kevin was not a catastrophic failure. Kevin was a soldier who hadn't worked out. It happens. People enlist, they can't hack it, they get separated, they go home. The paperwork doesn't capture the grease trap or the diesel or the 14 soldiers in the aid station or the 2 notebooks full of incidents that range from baffling to dangerous. The paperwork says it didn't work out. Thanks you for your service. Here's your DD-214. I had mixed feelings about the general discharge. Part of me thought Kevin deserved an honorable because Kevin had never once done anything wrong on purpose. Kevin had tried. Every day, Kevin had tried. The Army was separating him for something he couldn't control, which felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate without sounding like I was defending the man who nearly set the MKT on fire. The other part of me thought a general was generous given 14 soldiers in the aid station. I went back and forth on this for about a day, and then stopped thinking about it because it wasn't my call, and thinking about Kevin's feelings was a luxury I had not been able to afford for 5 months. Kevin took the news the way Kevin took everything. Calmly. He sat in the commander's office while the commander explained the separation process. He nodded at the right times. He said, "Yes, sir," and "I understand, sir." And then he signed the documents without reading them, which was consistent with every other document Kevin had ever signed in my presence. I stood in the back of the room and watched him and tried to read something on his face. Anger? Relief? Sadness? Confusion? Anything? Kevin's face was Kevin's face. Pleasant. Neutral. The face of a man who had been told it was going to rain later and had decided not to bring an umbrella. The separation process takes about 3 weeks. Out processing, CIF turn-in, medical screening, finance, legal brief. During those 3 weeks, the soldier is still assigned to the unit, still shows up, still works. The Army doesn't let you sit in your barracks room and wait. You do your job until the day you don't have a job anymore. So Kevin was still in my DFAC for 3 more weeks. I kept him on dish pit. He washed dishes. He showed up on time. He said good morning. He was, as always, polite. The rest of the team handled the news differently. Torres said, "Finally," and then immediately looked guilty about saying it. Daniels, who had nearly caught fire at the MKT, said nothing. Shen, who had spent more time with Kevin than anyone except me, was quiet for a while, and then said, "I feel bad for him, Sergeant." I said, "I know." Shen said, "He wasn't trying to be bad at this." I said, "I know that too." There is something about Kevin's politeness that made the whole thing harder than it should have been. A shitbag you can separate with a clean conscience. You tried, they didn't, goodbye. Kevin tried. Every single day. Kevin never once gave me attitude. Kevin never once refused a task or showed up late or left early or complained about being put on the dish pit when he was trained and qualified to cook. He just washed dishes and said Roger and went back to his barracks room at the end of the shift and did whatever Kevin did in the evenings. I pictured him sitting on his bunk flipping through the flashcards I had made him, studying for a test that no longer mattered for a job he was losing. And I had to stop picturing it because it didn't help. The LT came to see me during the second week. He stood in the DFAC office doorway, the way he always did when he had something to say that he wasn't sure how to say. He said, "Sergeant, do you think we did the right thing?" I said, "Sir, I think we did the only thing the system gave us." He said, "That's not what I asked." I looked at him. He had been in the Army for about 8 months at this point. Kevin was one of his first soldiers. The LT had watched the whole thing from the beginning. He had suggested more training. He had believed in the process. The process had produced a food safety incident and a chapter packet. I said, "Sir, I think if Kevin stayed, someone would eventually get hurt worse than a bad night in the latrine. And I think that matters more than whether Kevin tried hard." The LT nodded. He didn't look satisfied. He looked like a man who had learned something about the job they hadn't covered at OCS, which is sometimes doing the right thing and doing the kind thing are not the same thing, and you don't get to pick both. During the second week of out processing, Kevin came to me with a question. This was unusual. Kevin did not ask questions often. Kevin operated on whatever internal logic Kevin operated on, and questions were not part of that system. He said, "Sergeant, can I cook one more time before I go?" I said no. He said, "Just breakfast, just eggs. I know how to do eggs." I said, "Kevin, I know you know how to do eggs. That was never the issue." He looked at me for a moment, longer than Kevin usually looked at anything. Kevin's default eye contact was brief and passing, the way you'd glance at a clock. This was different. He was looking at me like he was trying to find something in my face, or trying to decide whether to say something he hadn't said before. Then he said, "I know I messed up a lot, Sergeant." I didn't say anything. I have learned when to create a silence. This time, I wasn't using a technique, I just didn't have words. I don't know why I messed up. I know the stuff. I study it. I know. And then I get in there and it's like my hands do something different than what my head is saying. I can hear the right answer in my head while I'm doing the wrong thing. I just can't stop it. It's like watching yourself from across the room. He stopped. He was looking at the floor now. I thought if I studied harder, it would fix it. I studied really hard, Sergeant. I know he did. I saw him study. I saw the flashcards worn at the edges from being handled. I saw him in the break room with the TB-MED 530 manual open to sections I hadn't assigned. Kevin studied harder than soldiers who were twice as capable and half as motivated. It didn't matter. Studying gave Kevin knowledge. Knowledge was never Kevin's problem. That was the most Kevin ever said to me about Kevin. In 5 months, Kevin had never once described what it was like to be Kevin. He had never acknowledged the gap. He had never said, "I know this is wrong while I'm doing it." I had assumed Kevin didn't notice or care. I had assumed Kevin existed in a state of oblivious confidence, doing wrong things and believing they were right. That was easier. That made Kevin a deficiency, a line item, a problem to solve and move on from. Kevin standing in my DFAC telling me he could hear the right answer while doing the wrong thing was not a line item. That was a person describing something that sounded like a wiring problem he had no control over. And I am not a doctor, and I am not a psychologist, and I am a sergeant in the United States Army, whose job was to run a DFAC, not to diagnose whatever was happening inside Kevin's head. But I stood there, and I heard him. And for the first time in 5 months, I wasn't thinking about Kevin as a deficiency or a liability or a line in a notebook. I was thinking about a 19-year-old kid who knew something was wrong with him and couldn't name it and couldn't fix it, and had joined the army maybe hoping that structure and discipline and clear procedures would be the thing that finally made his hands do what his head was telling them. It wasn't. The army wasn't the fix. But I understood in that moment why he had joined, and why he had picked 92G, and why he studied so hard. Kevin wasn't trying to cook. Kevin was trying to be someone whose knowledge and doing were in the same room. The army was supposed to be the hallway. It wasn't. I did not let him cook eggs. It was the right call. I would make it again, but I heard him. Kevin's last day was a Friday in late February, cold for brag. He turned in his gear at CIF that morning. He cleared finance. He got his DD 214. I know because I tracked his out-processing checklist the same way I tracked everything else about Kevin. Because even on his last day, I could not stop documenting him. He came by the DFAC one more time around 1400 in civilian clothes, jeans, and a hoodie. He looked younger in civilian clothes. He looked like what he was, which was a kid who had been in the army for less than 6 months and was going home. He returned a thermometer he had accidentally taken home in his cargo pocket, which I did not even know was missing. I checked it later. It was calibrated correctly. I don't know what to do with that. He shook my hand. He shook Shen's hand. Torres nodded at him from across the kitchen, and Kevin nodded back. And that was the extent of their goodbye, which was appropriate given the grease trap. Daniels was off shift. Kevin said, "Thank you, Sergeant. I learned a lot." I wanted to say something useful. Something an NCO is supposed to say to a departing soldier that wraps things up and sends them off with some piece of wisdom they can carry. I had nothing. Everything I could think of was either dishonest or cruel. "Good luck out there. You'll do great." That was a lie. I hope you learned your lesson. He hadn't learned anything because learning was never the problem. I said, "Take care of yourself, Kevin." He walked out of the DFAC. I watched him across the parking lot. He walked to a pickup truck where someone was waiting. A man in the driver's seat. Father, maybe. Uncle. Someone who had driven to Fort Bragg to bring Kevin home. Kevin got in the passenger side. He didn't look back at the building. The truck pulled out of the lot and turned left, toward the main gate. I went back inside. The DFAC was quiet. Torres was preparing for lunch. Shen was restocking the walk-in. The walk-in was organized correctly. The thermometers were calibrated. The sanitizer buckets were at the right concentration. Everything was exactly the way it was supposed to be. It had been that way before Kevin, and it was that way after Kevin. And the only evidence Kevin had ever been there was a stack of counseling statements in a filing cabinet and an inspection score that took us 6 months to recover from. That should be the end of the story. Kevin left, the DFAC went back to normal, I went back to running my shift without spending half my energy on one soldier. That should be enough. But there's one more thing. About 3 months after Kevin separated, I was at the PX, Saturday afternoon. I was buying motor oil and minding my own business. A staff sergeant from a maintenance company was in the same aisle. We knew each other, in the way that NCOs at the same installation know each other, which is to say, we'd been in the same meetings and nodded at each other. He asked me how things were going. I said fine. He said he'd heard about the food safety incident back in December. I said yeah. He said he was sorry about that. Then he said, "We had one of those." I said, "One of what?" "A Kevin. Not the same guy, different name, different MOS, military occupational specialty, but the same thing. Kid could pass any written test you gave him, could not be trusted to change a tire without supervision. Told him left, he went right. Told him right, he went left. Showed him the TM, he could recite it. Handed him the wrench, he'd take apart the wrong component. We had him in the motor pool for 7 months. It was the longest 7 months of my career, and I've been to Iraq twice." I said, "How'd it end?" He said, "Chapter 13, same as yours, I'm guessing. General discharge. Kid went home. He was a good kid, that was the worst part. He wasn't a dirtbag, he just couldn't do it." I said, "Did he know he was doing it wrong?" He said, "I asked him once. He said it was like watching a movie of himself, said he couldn't stop." I stood in the motor oil aisle at the PX at Fort Bragg on a Saturday afternoon and felt something I had not expected to feel about Kevin, which was that Kevin was not unique. Kevin was not a once-in-a-career anomaly that I could file away as the strangest thing that ever happened to me and never think about again. Kevin was a type. Kevin was a category that the Army and the world at large don't have a name for quite yet. Somewhere on some post right now, there is a sergeant standing in front of a soldier who can pass every test and fail every task. And that sergeant is starting a notebook, and that sergeant thinks they're the only one, and that sergeant does not know yet how many pages it's going to take. The staff sergeant and I stood there for a minute. We didn't say much else. There wasn't much to say. We had both been through the same thing and could come out the other side, and neither of us had an answer for it. He bought his oil, I bought mine. We went our separate ways. I don't know where Kevin is now. I hope he's okay. I hope he found something where the gap between knowing and doing doesn't matter as much, or where someone figured out how to build the hallway between those two rooms in his head. I hope whatever is going on with Kevin has a name and a treatment, and someone who knows more about it than I do. I hope someone is listening to him instead of testing him. I lost the notebooks, both of them. They were put in a box that didn't make it between duty stations. Somewhere between Bragg and my next post, a moving company lost the box, or it ended up in someone else's storage unit, or it's sitting in a warehouse in Virginia. I don't know. I filed a claim. The Army reimbursed me for the value of 2 green hardcover notebooks at $3.99 each. $7.98. That is what the Army determined Kevin was worth in documented form. It bothers me more than it should, not because I need the notebooks, I remember what's in them. But here's what I think about. The Army is going to give some sergeant another Kevin. Somewhere on some post right now, it's probably already happening. And when that sergeant starts looking for answers, starts asking around, starts wondering if they're the only one who's ever dealt with this, I want them to find this post. It's not you. You didn't fail. You followed every regulation and every procedure. And it still went sideways because the system does not have a box for that yet. Here's what's coming. Here's what I tried. Here's what didn't work. Here's what almost worked. And here's what I wish I'd done differently. Which is nothing, because I've gone through it 100 times, and there is nothing I would change. Here's how many pages it takes to even begin to process the depths of DFAC Kevin. Honestly, I was very concerned that this would end with punching down on Kevin for what is very clearly some sort of processing disorder. But no, thankfully. OP instead wants it to be known that people like Kevin exist. That people who can know the information and material front to back, but their body just doesn't want to cooperate, exist. OP just wants the box for Kevin to exist. Thank you all for tuning in to this extra long episode of Stories About Kevin, the DFAC Kevin Saga. I'll be sure to catch you all tomorrow. Take care.